Welcome to Criminal Procedure Investigation. Another nice way to say this is constitutional law as you thought it was before you came to law school, right? This is the con law that everybody sees on Law and Order. This is the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment, the 14th Due Process Amendment, all those things that, that make lawyers cool, at least in my mind. I love this class. This is my favorite class to teach in all of law school, and the reason that it's my favorite class to teach is because we get to do some really interesting things simultaneously. We get to talk about the practice of law as it relates to being a criminal lawyer, either a prosecutor or a defense attorney. We get to talk about jurisprudential philosophy, what it means to make certain decisions in the way that law develops and the impact that it has on society. And we get to talk about why things should be or not be a certain way. And that's a really cool thing to do, and we get to do it through the rubric of the Supreme Court cases that are foundational to the country. And so for me, I think of it as the upper level seminar that I teach. I just happen to always teach it in a classroom setting because there are always too many of you to do it in a seminar format. What I want to get done today is I want to give you an idea of what my overarching theme for this class is going to be, the what and the why of what we're going to focus on, and the mechanics and expectations of the course. That's the whole goal today, is to give you a clear sense of what I intend to accomplish over the course of the semester and some idea of how the structure is going to work. And we're going to do it using the preliminary discussion problem that's in the beginning of the book, and we're going to do it using a rubric that I think is really helpful, that you can then apply to analyze every Supreme Court case for the rest of the semester. I understand the mechanics of what's necessary for bar passage. I understand what you need to know and how you need to know it, and I know how the subjects that I teach are tested. So I can tell you with specificity how criminal procedure is going to be tested, and I'll teach it to you in a way so that you'll be able to deal with the multiple choice questions that you see on the bar. In a nutshell, criminal procedure is hard to test on the bar because if you stray very far from the specific fact determinative cases in the area, you can't write a question that can be answered in a multiple choice fashion. This means that if you can condense and commit to memory the specific tests from the cases that we're going to learn this semester, you will be able to handle any criminal procedure multiple choice question on the multi-state without very much trouble, because it's got to track relatively closely to the jurisprudence. And there are fundamental tests in each of those areas. So we're going to learn totality of the circumstances. We're going to talk about what's probable cause. We're going to look at the two-pronged test for reasonable expectation of privacy. So you'll have all of these tests firmly in your mind, tied to the facts of the particular cases. You won't have problems on the criminal procedure portion of the multi-state bar. You'll actually find it to be one of the easier sections when you take the exam. That's been my historical experience over the last 10 years. That's sort of the foundation for me. That's the baseline. If I don't teach you how to deal with the bar questions, then I haven't been competent in my job as part of it. So I'm going to do that. But we're going to go way beyond that. We're going to build a house of being criminal defense lawyers and being prosecutors, and how we actually do this stuff, how we actually apply it in the real world. We're going to talk about criminal law, and we're going to talk about criminal procedure, but this is actually more interesting than criminal law, because this is constitutional concepts. This is the very fabric of the nation. I mean, I was playing Alexander Hamilton before class started. This goes all the way back to the argument between Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison about how the country is supposed to work, about the balance between the power of the state and the rights of the individual. I mean, the things that we're going to talk about are literally embedded in the history of our country, and that's sort of cool, because lawyers, we're kind of I shudder to use this word because it has negative connotations. At a certain level, we're like the priests and priestesses of the law. And the law is the religion that binds the country together. It's the one thing that we all turn to, that we think will provide us at least a shot at fairness and opportunity. So there's a lot to unbottle there. I don't think you'll be disappointed. All right, well, we'll talk about cops a lot this semester. It will be interesting to see to me what you as a group think of cops, Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, all of those issues that are rotating around the use of force right now. We'll talk about those in class. I don't shy away from those because if I do, then I'm not teaching you the class. I'll let you know ahead of time, I don't have an axe to grind one way or the other. I see validity on both sides of the issues. And so it'll be interesting to see what you collectively as a class think. Oh, investigation is much more interesting than adjudication. Adjudication is just the nuts and bolts of, how you process the meat. We're deciding which animals to kill. It's a lot more fun here. Let's look at this. The rights of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. That's the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. We'll spend about 6 or 7 weeks talking about it. But just think, you're sitting there trying to draft a Bill of Rights to attach to the Constitution to guarantee some individual rights. And all law, to a certain extent, is reactive, right? This is in reaction to the experience of the War of Independence and the way in which the English courts and the Crown had dealt with the colonies. The rights of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effect against, so we split it there, unreasonable searches and seizures. We're going to spend an awful lot of time talking about unreasonable and reasonableness, trying to define that word. Where's the line where the state can or cannot go? Shall not be violated, period. No exception in the amendment. And no warrant shall issue, but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the places to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. So a warrant has got to have probable cause, an oath or a swearing, with particular descriptions in order to be valid. And you can't issue a warrant without those things. Now, looking at that statute, do you think that you have to have a warrant in order for the search to be reasonable? Or are those two separate clauses? One test is the reasonableness of the search, and then there's another category having to do with a warrant search. So is the first one warrantless searches, and the second one warrant searches, or is it all together? John, what do you think?
I believe that warrant searches must also be reasonable. However, the way it's written, I believe that they do talk about two separate subjects.
So you see it as two separate subjects. I'm not tracking on your name right now.
Keangela.
You're going to have to say it slower.
Keangela.
Keangela.
Yes, that's me.
Have I had you in class before?
Yep.
I did, and I had that problem with your name last time too, didn't I?
Uh-huh.
And it was too hard for me to say, and so I didn't say it for the rest of the semester.
You didn't say it at all.
I didn't say it at all. Keangela. I will say it this semester. Keangela.
Okay.
So Keangela, do you agree with John?
I do agree with them. I think they're separate.
Well, what do you think about that idea that they should be separate? Does that make sense to you?
It makes sense to me.
Why?
I personally don't think that you should have a warrant all the time. I think that there are necessary times where you can search and it be reasonable. And it's important that you go ahead and do it at that time before evidence is tampered with or moved, as long as it's reasonable. And of course, you can always do the warrant situation, but that takes time.
Well, Keangela, are you comfortable giving discretion to the folks who are doing searches without the warrant? Because the idea that you don't have to have a warrant is empowering someone to intrude without the oversight of a magistrate, right?
Yes.
Are you comfortable with that?
While I think that the language and the idea is very good, it's not executed very well, and the people who are doing it in how I think is unreasonable manner.
John and then Austin.
I feel like the oversight of the magistrate and the unwarranted searches comes on the back end. So it still has to be oversight. For instance, let's say a cop pulls you over inside the search and it's an unreasonable search, and then you get taken to jail or whatever, the magistrate will then overturn it based on unreasonableness. Is that inconvenient to the person who got arrested? Yes, it is. However, it does work because eventually you'll be, in a perfect system, you'll be let go if the search is done.
So you're putting your trust in the review of the process after the fact,
Yes.
at either the trial or the appellate level.
Yes.
And you're comfortable with that.
'Cause it's
Kiangela is not comfortable with that.
Not at all.
Why are you not comfortable with it?
Because that's time. Now this person, you have to be thinking reasonably. Imagine I have now gotten searched illegally or unreasonably.
Well, you've lost liberty, haven't you?
I've lost liberty, I'm locked up, I lost my job, I'm now behind in rent, blase, I'm in there 6 months, and you say, oh, my bad, it was unreasonable, go ahead and go home, and my whole life is screwed up because you.
Well, as a prosecutor, I can destroy you. If I investigate you and lock you up and you don't have the means to get out while the case is pending, I can destroy your life and be completely wrong through the powers of my investigation, my ability to have a grand jury, to orient the cops. I have the ability. I mean, there's an awful lot of power there underneath prosecutorial discretion. This issue, do you think, how many of you have had an interaction with a police officer that was not friendly? You just look like a guy, all the way in the back, you look like a guy who would have an interaction with a cop that was not friendly. Are you comfortable sharing that interaction?
Yeah.
What happened?
I was fishing.
Oh, so you're fishing without a license?
No, I was fishing. All right. So, I was at the Dunedin Causeway, Dallas County, with my buddy, and we were fishing, and there was a sign that said no fishing past 11 without a license, city ordinance, whatever. I had my fishing license, so we were shark fishing. And there was people like ripping up the beach in trucks and stuff, and cops were all over the place, stopping anyone who was there past 11 o'clock. So we got hungry, so we ordered Domino's pizza at like 11 o'clock at night, had it delivered to us. And as we're walking
On the bridge, on the causeway.
Yeah.
Domino's will deliver to the causeway?
Well, we gave them the address to the kayak shop, kayak shop, because they wouldn't deliver to us on the bridge. So anyway, got pizza walking back, and then my legs are black and all this shit.
And they weren't happy with you?
No, they weren't. They're like, get over here, put the pizzas on the car.
Okay, the most important point, did you get to keep the pizza?
Yes, I did.
Okay, so they didn't take your pizza.
No, they didn't.
Because you said it in a way that made me feel like the cops were just rousting you to get you.
That's why I was upset. But anyway, so they were like, what do you guys do over here? I was like, we're fishing. They're like, go get your gear one at a time. I was like, that's going to take like 20 minutes. Like, we have all of our stuff spread out, like set up. Just let me see your IDs. And I was like studying for the LSAT at the time. And he's like, what's in the car? I was like, LSAT books, what's that, law school exam? And then he kind of like,
That was the end of that.
bullshit. And then he's like, go get your gear and get out of here. So we left. But it was just kind of like we were being polite, and I kind of like challenged him. I was like, it says licenses. Here's my license. He's like, no, you need a city license. I was like, okay.
Boy, in the annals of bad interactions with police officers, that's not much.
Yeah.
Anybody ever been put on the hood or handcuffed? Or had a friend who was? Everybody's done that?
I said, no one's gonna tell that.
No, they probably won't. That's why I said, or had a friend who had it happen to. Have you ever seen it happen to someone? There's something that's violently intrusive about someone physically manhandling your body and then restraining you against your will. Against your will. Now, when it's for your will, then perhaps it's enjoyable. It just depends upon what floats your boat. But if it's against your will, it's a completely different animal. When you're no longer allowed to move. When the control of your physical person has been taken over by someone else. But as a class, we're starting in the position of we're comfortable giving that discretion to law enforcement. Is there anybody who's not comfortable giving that discretion to law enforcement? Nobody in the class? Austin?
Well, I'm okay with it, but if I were to make the argument, I would take it from the last two phrases there about the place and person and things. Specifically, if, let's say we have an evidentiary or a hot pursuit, and it goes into a house, and then suddenly opens up a much more, my concern, I guess, is what is the check on what he's getting out of his time in that house? Will he start going into desk drawers, or how far will he go there? There's nothing.
You want to know where the lines are?
Right, well, there really is no line at that point. If he's just chasing a suspect and he's like, oh, there's a strange looking safe over there.
Well, the argument about where the lines are part of the definition of Fourth Amendment jurisprudence. And we'll read cases that actually talk about those things that give us some idea, but even they are not complete, right? But is there no one here who really does not trust cops?
Oh, you ain't saying that.
No, wait a minute. You're saying as a group, give them discretion. They've got to be able to do their job.
In a perfect world,
It's a good idea.
No, they need discretion.
No, but we live in the real world here. Are we going to give this guy with a high school education, who's got Dunlop disease? Y'all know what Dunlop disease is, right? His belly's Dunlopped over his belt buckle.
Like, even in this world, I don't trust cops. My mom's been a sheriff for 25 years. But in this case, you need
What did your mom tell you to do whenever you have interaction with cops, John?
be as polite as possible and keep your mouth closed.
Yeah, yes sir, no sir, hands on the wheel.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
and like my thing is, even in this world, like I don't trust police, but I recognize these things are necessary because someone.
Why?
Because if you don't do it, then the bad guys get away, for lack of a better word. If a cop pulls someone over and they can smell alcohol in your blood.
Okay, so no, let's back up here for a minute. The bad guys get away. We're designing a criminal system, a series of laws to investigate and intrude upon the rights of the people to be secure. As we design that system, who gets the benefit of the doubt? The rights of the individual person or the rights of the collective for safety? Yeah.
I was just going to piggyback on John's comment. I agree with him. In our world today, people do abuse their discretion, but if you take that discretion away and the alternative, if they're in a hot pursuit and it's life-threatening to someone, a victim, then they need that discretion to be able to search or to be able to stop the situation from occurring. And if they didn't have that discretion in the moment, then worse things could happen.
What I'm hearing is that you believe the rights of the collective to be safe and secure is more important from a value judgment perspective than the rights of the individual to be free and unencumbered by the state.
I mean, that's a bold statement, but
Well, if I am extracting incorrectly, tell me.
no, I mean, I would say yes to a point.
There's a line past which you're not comfortable with it.
Right.
But on balance, you feel like we have to deal with this collective safety issue,
Right.
and that all of us perhaps need to give away some freedom in order to achieve for the greater good. That's actually a philosophical argument. That's the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. That's what that is. That's John Stuart Mill's, or it's also the rule in Spock from Star Trek 4. Spock literally quotes that. It's the needs of the few outweigh the needs of the many or the one. What is it like this, right? Yeah, I can only do it with this hand. I can't do it with this hand because I'm left-handed. This hand's too strong to spread the fingers apart. That little soliloquy was brought to you courtesy of my attention deficit disorder. But back to this idea of the needs of the many outweighing the needs of the few or the one. I don't see that in this amendment. Where do you see that in this amendment? It doesn't say the rights of the people to be safe. It doesn't say the rights of the people to be protected. It says of the rights of the people to be secure in their persons, places, and effects. Yeah.
I think that would play into the reasonableness versus unreasonableness.
So that's where you see it, is in the reasonableness.
If you're protecting other people, then it would maybe be reasonable to perform that search.
So it's reasonable to intrude without the oversight of a magistrate.
You wouldn't have to necessarily take that oversight away, would you? It's just...
Well, you guys are telling me that cops should be allowed to search without getting approval at the time.
In certain situations.
And so you would define it by situations.
So if it's
Hot pursuit is the one that everyone goes to, or exigent circumstances. You know, the baby's going to be murdered, or the criminal's going to get away. Well, what if it's not hot pursuit, or the baby's going to be murdered, and instead it's the criminal's going to get by with some illicit activity? You see that? Yeah, John?
If it's not exigent circumstances or hot pursuit, then you get that warrant. Like,
Then you want the warrant requirement.
only time, like, in my opinion, only time you get a search that without a warrant is if it's in, like, for lack of a better word, dire circumstances. And dire is a strong word, but you pretty much get the gist of what I'm saying. Like, sometimes you need action in the moment. Every time you don't. Let's say you're doing an investigation, and let's say you finally feel like you have the guy who's been selling all the drugs. You know he lives in this house. So if that's the case, go get the warrants and go kick in the door at the house. But don't just go kick in the door in the house.
Well, what if you know because he's black and there's shoes hanging on the wire, and everybody knows if there's shoes hanging on the wire, it's a drug house, but you don't actually have evidence?
If you don't have evidence, ain't no warrant, it's not reasonable.
But I'm a cop. I've been doing this for 30 years. I know these guys when I see them. Walking down the street, I can tell you that
That's not enough.
that's not enough.
It's not enough. If there's no evidence, then what do you have? You have speculation.
No, I have my experience.
Yeah, that's what.
You don't like that?
that's what people call
Johanna?
speculation.
That's subjective discretion that you're giving to individuals who are often not trained to the fullest extent that they could be. So she was talking in a very black and white manner, and it's not a very cut and dry, this side or this side. What about training law enforcement officers that, like you mentioned, often have a lower level of education, or maybe in the system for some reason that isn't just?
You're looking for the solution
Yes,
to the problem.
that's what I did.
And that's your problem solver. That's great. But I'm looking right now for the value behind the issue. Where's the societal value that we think is most important? Is it security or is it individual freedom? Because I would bet that if I got you alone, or if we were sitting in a bar, your response would be, well, everybody's individual freedom should be given up to some degree for the good of all, except for mine. Except for mine. And don't come take mine, because mine is special. Yeah.
Mine was kind of going off the honest. I feel like the general population of law enforcement aren't experienced enough. You put yourself, for example, you've been in the military for so long. Your reaction to a certain amount of fear is much different than someone at 5 years of experience.
Oh yeah, I actually look for it.
You don't know when to react a different way versus an inexperienced officer, which is exactly what happens today. These officers aren't experienced enough, or they don't know when to draw the line as opposed to draw the gun.
Well, we talked about this in evidence class last semester. Many of you, we make micro decisions based upon a variety of factors that we observe both on the surface and underneath. How many of you have read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow? Has anybody in here read that book? It came out a couple of years ago, and what Kahneman talks about is the way that human beings process their environment, right? And psychologists posits that we've got two fundamental ways that we deal with stuff right now. One is on the logic level system, which is what we teach in law school, this idea that you rationally process information step by step and come to a conclusion. What Kahneman posits is that there's actually a decision-making matrix that happens below the surface that is much more involved with assessing threat in the environment, reading body language, appearance, behavior, applying that in light of our previous experiences, and making immediate determinations about threat or lack of threat, about friendliness or aggression. What's really interesting is from an animal perspective, we are actually driven, most folks think, by the stuff that's happening underneath, that's happening in the moment, that's not logical, that's not reasoning, that is a very ape-like response to the environment, designed to keep us alive long enough to reproduce and pass our genetic material on. And on top of that, we've laid this idea of logic. We think that the two go hand in hand. They actually don't. In the moment, when threatened, we fall back to the more basic way of responding to a situation. The only way to stop that is to train someone sufficiently that then you change the paradigm of how they in the moment assess the threat. And that's what happens with cops. How many of you have a friend who's a police officer? Have you ever noticed where they sit when they sit in a public room? Do they ever sit with their back to the door? No. Soldiers don't do that either. If you've been in combat or you've been in stressful situations, you're always assessing the environment to see from what area a threat might come. It becomes ingrained in you. It becomes just part of what you do to survive. It makes you a little bit crazy in the eyes of the civilian world. Yeah, and there's an adjustment period that occurs when you come back. Our cops are in that environment all the time, and there's never an adjustment period because they never come back. They are always in a fight or flight mode. It's one of the reasons that they'll shoot someone and everybody else goes, "What the hell were you thinking?" And then everyone will go, you know, all the talking heads on the news, "Well, that guy's going to be convicted. He clearly committed murder." And then he goes to trial, and what happens? They get acquitted. Because the story of the cop's experiences to that date, looking at the reasonableness or the unreasonableness of their actions, or maybe the mistake of fact of what they did, bringing in the criminal law defense to that moment, and they wind up acquitted. And we as a society shake our heads and go, "How could you acquit them for that?" It's actually a function of the way the criminal justice system works, John.
We can't always fall back on their experiences made them scared of the black man with the gun or without the gun.
I didn't say black at any point in time.
No, I know you didn't, but I'm saying black. Like we can't keep on falling back on that. Like, oh, because they never go, they're always in that situation. First of all, the majority of cops, like 90%, never even pull their gun. Ever.
Oh no, that's true. And
So-
some of them pull it all the time.
Yeah, some pull it all the time. But then, I won't stick for the fact that, oh, they're always in danger, they never leave that situation, so therefore, when they were in that situation, it was pull it or it's on them. No, because they have some better training when they have these problems. So because the training's not there, you got people who aren't prepared for these situations. So you have someone who's not trained getting in a situation where it's fight or flight, they're gonna sometimes they choose to fight when they shouldn't have. Because they were trained better, or they have some community policing standards, have people policing where they're supposed to be policing, or some goddamn diversity training, we're gonna have these problems. But since we don't train people the way they're supposed to be trained, we have big problems right now.
So
we keep focusing, oh, it's the cops. No, it's the people on top of the cops who aren't training their cops correctly. Until we correct that, this whole thing is gonna be up in the air.
what if we change the standard of what cops are or are not allowed to do? So that the cop can't roll up on somebody and try to shake them down to see if they've got drugs without a warrant. Because then somebody else would be looking at it. And the police officer would be there when someone responds and asks for help, but they wouldn't be out playing Joe detective without appropriate training.
Exactly.
There's an argument to be made that the reasonableness standard empowers police who are not trained to intrude too much into the lives of the general populace. Now, you know what? That works okay if everybody's the same race or everybody has the same cultural value system. It works just fine if the idea of implicit bias is something that you're not aware of. But the moment you accept that implicit bias is a possibility, the freedom, the discretion that we give law enforcement becomes problematic. There's an argument that that's never going to be fixed, that you can't train implicit bias out of people, and that giving discretion to law enforcement is actually getting Americans killed. There's that argument. What I find fascinating is that 30 minutes ago you were telling me, hey, cops have got to have discretion in a perfect world to do what they want to do. But what I'm actually getting from you is that the world's not perfect and they don't need discretion.
I believe the cops need discretion. Because I look at it in a practical sense. If a cop always had to get a warrant, too many bad things will happen, because that time period is too vast a period. However, I recognize that without proper training, this doesn't work. So, do I believe this is the correct standard? Yes. Do I believe this standard we need? Yes. But this standard only works without proper training.
You need to go into civil work and try 1983 cases is what you need to do, and make a lot of money. If you really believe that, looking at 1983 is one of the few federal statutes that gives you an opportunity to try to bring enough pressure on law enforcement to change their training modalities. Now, as a prosecutor, I did train law enforcement, and I can tell you that it's a never-ending struggle. You have to do it systemically, you have to do it collectively, and there has to be a thought process to it. And in most instances, that's not happening. Most instances, that's not happening. Primarily because the state doesn't have the budget to do the training, or the time, or the personnel. There's always this push-me-pull-you of resources.
Find money where you want to find money at.
I would put to you, from almost 60 years of life as opposed to 20-something years of life, when I was your age, I believe that you could fix this problem with training. I don't think that's possible anymore, because I don't think there'll ever be the resources devoted to it. So, in this age of computers, what would be the cost of requiring a warrant all the time? What would be the real cost of having somebody in a supervisory position say, yeah, go ahead, roll up on that house. Yeah, go ahead, rouse that kid. Go ahead, search. Except in those instances where life is threatened, what would be the cost? You know, a lot of the cases that we're going to read this semester were carved into the law at a time when cell phones did not exist, when the most exciting technological advance that we might have had was a wiretap on a telephone line or a thermal vision device to look at heat signatures. And from those, we've extrapolated an awful lot of cases. I don't know what the answer is, but I think this question of individual liberty versus collective security lies at the heart of the dichotomies that are in the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment. And in fact, it lies at the heart of the dichotomy that's within the country from a political perspective. From the push-me-pull-you between the Democrats and the Republicans. We're literally, 50 years ago, I was alive, I was about 6 years old. The country is right back where we were in 1968 in very many emotional ways. It's fascinating to me that for half a century, we've been churning these same issues. Now that may be because we made bad decisions, or it may be that the spot we're in right now is just a reflection of the human condition. I don't know. What time is class in? 11:55? Okay. I couldn't remember if it was 55 or 35. It takes me a while to get it straight in my head. Let's move on a little bit. Let's look at the Fifth Amendment. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger. So, if you want to hold me in jail pending crime, it's got to be a capital murder case or an infamous crime. Infamous crime is sort of like a felony, severe felony, right? And then there's this exception for militias and for times of war that's built into the Fifth Amendment. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb. That is literally the double jeopardy standard that we talk about all the time. You talked about it in criminal law. That comes from the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. Nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. That's why you can't call the defendant to testify. Why? Because in England, the first thing that they would do is call the defendant to testify and force them to incriminate themselves. Nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. When we talk about substantive due process, we're talking about the Fifth Amendment clause to the United States Constitution. When we talk about procedural due process, we're sort of talking about the Fifth Amendment, but we're also looking at some administrative remedies, right? Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. That's a great amendment, carving out a lot of individual rights. Do you see anywhere in there, you have the right to an attorney? If you cannot afford one, one will be provided for you. Before you talk to the cops, do you wish to waive this right? Do you see that anywhere? You see anything about custodial interrogation or where the line is drawn for when a cops can or cannot interview you or interrogate you. Yet we'll learn this semester that Miranda supposedly comes out of the language of this statute. It is not there anywhere. Some of the best Supreme Court rulings that really transform policy in the United States are actually grounded in crappy law based upon the idea of stare decisis. How many of you agree with the concept of Brown versus Board of Education? That schools should be desegregated and we should all be allowed to have equal access to education? Well, yeah. If you read that opinion, in light of all the jurisprudence that came before, it makes no damn sense. Because literally what the Supreme Court said was, we're going to make some law. We've had it. We've had it. It's a very interesting thing about constitutional law when it comes to Supreme Court decisions. Look at the Sixth Amendment. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. I find this stuff fascinating. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. You can see the guy who wrote the Declaration of the Independence in the language of the Sixth Amendment. The concern that Jefferson had about the rights of individuals. Now, historically, the sad part is that not everybody was an individual in the 18th century the way they are today. But just like Runnymede and the Magna Carta laid the foundation, this laid the foundation for the society wherein which we live. But the push-me-pull-you of individual rights versus the collective right of security and safety is an ongoing thing. This Sixth Amendment, we won't talk about a lot this semester. We will talk about it when we talk about the right to counsel, how the right to counsel attaches when you're indicted. John.
Mike, not to go too much into it, but it seems to me the Sixth Amendment is pretty clear, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. So I don't understand why it took us until Bruce Jacob lost to get right of counsel for all criminal convictions, for all criminal cases.
You're talking about Gideon v. Wainwright.
Yeah, not just like felonies. Because this doesn't say just felonies, it says assistance of counsel for his defense. Defense from misdemeanors, defense from felonies, defense from all things. So what made them look at it and say, oh, well, they just meant felonies in this case?
I'm going to throw your own words back at you. Cost, practicality, common sense, you know, I'll get that later. It would cost too much to do it. We don't really need due process for misdemeanor crimes. Come on, I mean that's an awful lot of work for just these small issues. We can trust the court system. We can trust the judge. It would be a waste of time and resources to do this. I mean, that's the answer. The answer is that we didn't think it was that important because we believed in the validity of the process.
We didn't think that someone up to a year in jail wasn't important enough for them to have counsel.
No, because if they were the right kind of people, they wouldn't be in that situation anyway. Now, you're asking me what was going on. It was a sociological phenomenon. Rights are not equal. Now, how many of you have read the evidentiary code from Louisiana from the 1800s? Nobody, I would imagine. My wife bought me an evidence book from 1822. Women, from an evidentiary perspective, were considered incompetent to testify. In most states, if you weren't a landowner, in some states you weren't competent to testify. And I'm not even talking about the people who weren't even considered people but were considered property. So the answer is these laws get interpreted every generation by the generation's values that exist. And what Bruce Jacobs was involved in was the case that decided, hey, you know what? Everybody has a right to due process under the Sixth Amendment. Everybody's got a right to counsel. The lawyer is the thing that protects us at the end of the day from the abuses of the state. The lawyer. That's the only protection that you actually have, is the protection of counsel. You guys haven't done it yet, but some of you very soon are going to have a client that's going to turn to you. And you'll be the only thing that stands between them and the overwhelming power of the state or the overwhelming power of the opposing side with their resources. Them and the law, that's it. That may be why a lot of you were actually attracted to this profession. The idea that I will have power to affect change and to protect people, or have power to make money. It's about the power that exists. We didn't think those people mattered. You know, if you were a vagrant and you were poor and it was just a misdemeanor offense, we didn't think you mattered. You weren't sufficiently human to be afforded the protections of the due process of law. And if you'll think about it from the standpoint of I run the government and I want the government to function effectively, maybe a corporate mentality, lawyers are not your friend, because lawyers ask questions and stand up for individuals. People don't like lawyers for that reason. But in a democracy, you're actually the lubrication that makes the engine run. An engine seizes up without oil and lubrication because the bearings won't turn. Lawyers are the lubrication for a democratic society. You know, that's just a very crass way of looking at it. I didn't think I was going to tell you that you were all a can of oil today, but apparently, or you can be grease, I don't care, actual grease, you know, whatever type of oil works. But truthfully, the lawyer looked at that and said, hey, that makes no sense. Now, Bruce Jacobs was on the wrong side of that issue, wasn't he? Why was he on the wrong side of that issue? Because he was in the state attorney's office and it was his job to argue it. You know what Bruce spent the rest of his life doing? Fighting for the rights of indigent people. Do you know he still takes cases of prisoners? He still does prison litigation. He's 83 years old. By the way, he's retiring at the end of this year.
What?
It was announced at the faculty meeting yesterday. He told me a couple of weeks ago he's going to stop teaching. He's going to continue to write. He'll keep his office here at the law school, but this semester will be the last semester that Bruce Jacobs teaches at Stetson University College of Law in a full-time capacity. It's an end of an era. It's an end of an era. But that's a case that transformed the way the world was seen. In fact, a lot of the cases we're going to talk about this semester, the world looked one way in the eyes of society and the eyes of the law before the case, and it looked the other way after that case. In fact, the first two cases that we're going to read are Maps and Week, which establish the exclusionary rule. This idea that if law enforcement violates your constitutional rights, the remedy is to exclude the evidence at trial. Those will be the first ones that we'll look at. This semester, in the Fourth Amendment, I'm going to be looking at the reasonableness clause, the warrant clause, and warrantless searches. So we're going to develop tests for reasonable versus unreasonable. We're going to develop tests for how the warrant should be applied in order to be valid. And we're going to look at those warrantless searches. When should they be admissible and when should they be excluded? At the Fifth Amendment level, we'll talk a little bit about double jeopardy. We'll talk a lot about compelled self-incrimination, which is the Miranda right. And then we'll talk some about substantive due process, primarily as it applies to confessions, coerced confessions, and eyewitness identifications and lineups, right? In the Sixth Amendment, we're really going to be looking at assistance of counsel. Assistance of counsel. And that's the Messiah and Escobedo cases, this idea that you get a lawyer, because the question becomes at what point do you get the lawyer? And we're going to read the Fifth Amendment and the Sixth Amendment in conjunction with each other, because they're rights that both deal with assistance to counsel, but they attach at different times. And those of you who've had me in class before will know that we'll use a timeline to identify where each statutory provision applies, and we'll identify the gaps, the weak points, where potentially, if they talk, it can be important. So that's what we'll look on that. You've all are 2 L's or 3 L's. You've been in criminal law. You've had, some of you probably have had constitutional law at this point. Has anybody ever talked to you about how constitutional jurisprudence develops? This is where the audience interacts with the instructor, thereby enhancing the learning experience. Has anybody ever talked about the development of jurisprudence? I want to give you this idea of a pyramid, right? When we're thinking about jurisprudence from a constitutional perspective, Supreme Court cases, the first thing that happens is that the constitutional right is identified in a seminal case. The court looks down and says, hey, this right exists. For those of you who were in evidence recently, it's the concept of testimonial evidence as expressed in the Crawford opinion. Before that Crawford opinion, testimonial evidence did not exist as a concept in jurisprudence. So the first case will identify the right. The next series of cases define the right and establish tests for determining where the rights have been violated. So some cases identify, some cases define, then some cases develop the contours of that protected right, fact-specific situations. And then eventually we reach the case that says, well, this is the scope of the right and it goes no further. We're not going to push it here. That's as far as we go. This pyramid with these bands is really helpful as we're reading criminal procedure cases. Why? Because you got to be able to identify what type of case you're reading. Am I reading a constitutionally protected right case, a seminal case in the area? Am I reading something that's just defining or protecting? Is this something that's just giving me some contours so I can analogize it to another case? Or is this one that's saying, hey, this is as far as it goes and no further? Now, I can make it look really clean and crisp and clear with that graphic, right? That graphic is relatively simple to understand. The actual application and reading of it and picking it out can be somewhat more problematic. So, take a look at this discussion problem. It's in your book too. It's in the introductory materials. It's really all I asked you guys to read for this particular class. You got Dan, he's traveling on a bus, and the bus stops to get gas. You got an investigator who's doing drug interdiction duties at the Greyhound bus station. He looks inside the bus's lower luggage compartment, and he finds the luggage with a baggage ticket with Dan Diamond's name on it. He also discovers that Dan had paid cash on the day of travel. They take the luggage from the bus and they put it in the rear baggage terminal. Now, Nose is dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, but he's got his badge. He identifies himself as a law enforcement officer and tells Dan, hey, look, man, you're not in trouble, but would you come with me? Dan follows Nose to a room where his luggage is being held. The room's got 2 open doors, and there were 1 or 2 other officers already in the room. So you've got Dan and 2 to 3 cops in a room with the luggage, 2 open doors. And Nose says, do you mind if we look through your luggage? And Dan makes an affirmative verbal response. Gives him a yes in some fashion. During the search, Diamond suddenly begins to say, hey man, that luggage belongs to a friend. I'm just carrying it for them from one place to another. And they find bomb-making materials and terrorist propaganda in the luggage. Was the cops' examination of Diamond Dan's luggage legal? Yeah.
So yeah, you know, it's actually
So for you, once he said yes, these like boom, 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 all the way in the back.
I would say that up until asking permission, like grabbing the bag just because of some arbitrary reason.
Well, the reason was it was Dan's name, and Dan paid cash for the trip.
But that's not reasonable. I don't think that's reasonable.
Well, what the cop would say is that people engaged in illegal activity often pay for cash for tickets because they don't want to be tracked.
But I don't think it's not absolute enough.
It's not absolute enough for you. So you're like, nah. So you think the cop's actions before he said, yeah, you can search my luggage, are problematic.
Yes.
Does the consent to search the luggage obviate any concerns about how the police acted beforehand?
I would argue that because he was in the room with 3 other cops, that could be kind of like.
But the doors were open. He could have left at any time. He wasn't in handcuffs.
But it's one of those situations that for someone that wouldn't know their rights, it would just be kind of implied that.
Implied coercion.
Yeah.
Kiana?
I think everything was wrong.
Oh, everything's wrong.
Everything's wrong. First, I don't think that he should have took it. Paying with cash is not enough. People do that all the time. I can say, hey, I want to just go somewhere today.
Well, people from some social stratospheres pay with cash, and others don't.
And some people just pay with cash. I have a friend who just doesn't own a car. Just believes that cash is the way to go.
Okay.
Dumbest thing I've ever heard.
Or she's not being tracked, one of the two, except for when she withdraws money from the bank, assuming that she has a bank.
Yeah, definitely has a bank.
Okay.
I don't think that the luggage should have been taken. I don't think that was risk enough. I think that it was fine that he came and said, hey, can you come talk to me? I think it was wrong that you put him in this room with these other 2 cops.
You don't like that?
I don't like that. I feel like if I was in that situation, I would feel like I'm detained. Whether the doors are open or
Okay, let me
not.
stop you for a minute. Should we consider whether Diamond Dan feels that he's detained
Yes.
under a subjective standard of what Dan feels or the objective standard of what society thinks is reasonable in that situation?
I think it was subjective standard because
But the criminal is always going to say after the fact, I felt like I didn't have a choice.
well, he might have past experiences that made him more inclined to agree to it, rather than an objective standard where he'd be like, well, yeah, you know, you can tell.
You had your hand up.
Well, I was gonna say, not speaking on whether.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
But I think that when, like, he was traveling on a bus, if I was, it's different because the airlines are, but if you're on an airplane, you know that your luggage could get searched at any time.
Well, in our society now, you give up a great deal of freedom to travel by air.
If I was getting on a bus or a vehicle that was not mine, and whether it's a public bus or a private bus, if I was paying for a ticket, I would assume that they could search my luggage.
You would.
I think so, with the safety.
No.
I mean, there's a bomb in
No.
there.
Well, you see, here's the thing. This is really, we're going to figure out whether you're truly security people or individual rights people. I know you two think that you're but you're not. You're actually, leave me the hell alone unless I've done something wrong, people.
Yes.
That's what you are.
Yes.
Yeah, which I find fascinating is that they were saying all this stuff at the beginning of the class period about trust the cops and everything else, but when the truth comes out, they're like, no.
It's idealistic. We don't live in an idealistic world. This is reality. It's great.
So reality is you don't trust the police and you want them to leave you the hell alone.
Leave me the hell alone.
Well, so it's okay. Well, we've defined it, right? We've gotten to that point. Yeah.
But it's also a harsh reality that people are terrorists and bomb people every day. So, I mean, there's 2 sides to the story, and I see both valid points, but it's like.
Well, it could be that we're all going to die no matter what. Yeah. I mean, this is the issue. What's more important to you, individual freedom or collective security? This is the issue. And you guys have grown up in a decade where this question, ever since the planes flew into the Twin Towers, has consumed the United States public, has consumed it. And we've done all sorts of things that weren't contemplated from a security versus individual rights perspective. It may be that no matter how hard we try to be secure, we're always going to be subject to the possibility of a terrorist attack. It may be that you can't make us safe. At what point do we give up so much in the search for safety that it's not a life that's worth living anyway? That's the philosophical question that's behind this. And why do I find it fascinating? It's because you people, and I say you people in a loving way, you young lawyers are going to shape the contours of how this happens in the United States for the next generation. You're going to write those laws and you're going to do that stuff. You had your hand up a minute ago, and then over here.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I don't have a problem with anything that happened in the scenario.
Well, you want to be, I'm not surprised at all.
Because Dan could have said no at any time before the search. He could have said, no, I'm not going to that back room. And then-
Is Dan white or black?
That's why I-
I think
No black
Dan's
Dan.
Hispanic.
You think Dan's Hispanic? Is that because he came from California?
Dan Diamond is Hispanic.
Dan Diamond is Hispanic.
He might be Puerto Rican.
It might be Puerto Rican.
He like half Indian, half Mexican.
Well,
He might be Dominican, they dark skinned, so he might be.
first of all, does it matter what race Dan is?
It doesn't matter.
It should not matter. But do you think if you're a white guy and the cops say, I mean, go back to our pizza analogy. You know, he was like, I got a license. If you were a black guy at 11 o'clock at night, pulled over by the cops on the Dunedin Causeway, are you going to go, I got a license? Or are you going to say, yes, sir, I'll move my stuff?
Give me 10 minutes off, so I'm going.
Give me 10 minutes, officer, I'm gone.
Can you hold my pizza? I'm over.
Well, you know, this issue that we're talking about, the race issue, is actually directly related to a subjective versus an objective test. Because subjectively, people of different genders, different sexual orientations, different gender identities, different racial components feel fundamentally different in situations from other people do. Keanu.
I would agree with that, and I was just thinking, because if I was in that situation, I probably would have asked why like a million times.
Mhm.
But I think that's because I'm a woman. Can you come with me? Why?
Why?
I'm going. What for?
Yeah, what do you want?
You want to check your bag. Why? What you find in my bag? Did it open? Why?
Yeah.
Like, what's going on? But I feel like in this situation, it was probably a minority male, and that would be because if in a situation like that, I would tell my brother, just go. Whatever they ask you, yep, do it.
Well, but you'd hope that your brother wouldn't have a bomb in the luggage compartment.
I also hope that his bag is clean.
Yeah, his bag is clean.
At the same time, I would expect him or any other minority male, whenever an officer comes up with his badge and says, "Can I talk to you?" Yes.
Well, see, I grew up in Alabama where the cops couldn't write, and they'd hand you the pencil, and you'd fill out the ticket. So it was yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full. And if you were a poor white kid or a poor black kid, it didn't matter. If the cops were talking to you, you know, people got beat up and died in the Huntsville City Jail in the 60s and the 70s. I mean, you just died, and everybody knew it. And so you did whatever you had to do to avoid conflict that resulted in your getting arrested. And your hope was that if I'm clean and don't piss them off, they won't take me downtown. That was your hope.
Well, that's
Yeah.
why it's important that you know your rights, you know what you can do, what you know you don't have to go back in that room and have your bag searched. I think it's the responsibility of every citizen to know.
What if Dan had said, no, officer, I'm not comfortable going in that room with you and I don't want my bag searched? What if Dan had said that?
Then no problem, they put the bag back on the bus, he gets on the bus.
Now, that might be right.
Why wouldn't that?
Idealistically, under the law, that's exactly what the cops should do. It's exactly what the cops should do. If you trust the police and you think that they've done their job effectively and that they're going to follow the standards, if they don't have, what should they probably have to pull that bag off? Probable cause. They should have a reason to believe. Maybe Dan Diamond's name is on a terrorist watch list. If we knew that,
Then it's all Gucci.
then it's all good, right? But that's not where the cases come from. The cases come from, he looks suspicious to me. My spidey sense is tingling. Literally. The cops is like, something's not right here. We'll come back to Dan Diamond. This fact pattern, by the way, comes out of a Florida case. That's Supreme Court. You're going to discover there are a lot of Florida cases that make it up to the Supreme Court from a criminal procedure perspective, because we are the lint trap of the nation, right? Everything basically gets caught that's crazy in Florida at some point. It really does. You had your hand up.
Yeah, what's everybody pretending that the bag didn't come first?
Talk to me.
He didn't see he doesn't know who Diamond is, or
He did. There's no indication that he knew what he looked like.
he picked the bag at random.
Okay. Why do you think he picked the bag at random?
Yeah, because it says after he found the luggage and found the name on it.
Well, he looks inside the bus's lower luggage compartment and he found luggage displaying a baggage ticket with Diamond's name. And then he discovered that the guy had paid cash. So the first thing is he sees the bag, then he sees the name on the bag, and then he discovers the guy had cash. This question is actually a great lawyer question, if I'm teasing the cop's actions apart. If the appearance of the bag in the luggage compartment that people had access to, if the outward appearance of the bag caused the law enforcement officer to have a suspicion or a concern, then the additional step of identifying the name and checking the manifest to see how the guy paid. Because if he paid by credit card, what could he do pretty quickly? He'd run the numbers on, run the code on him, see what he was. But so he's got a bag that appears a particular way, he identifies the individual, and then sees that he paid by cash, and only after taking those 3 steps does the cop ask him to come off. Still, the police officer doesn't know what he has, but he's got a reason to inquire further in his mind, right? A reason to inquire further in his mind. The teaching point here is where you start analytically. What first piece you pick to tear apart, to focus on, paints a very different picture of the law enforcement actions. The defense attorney would go, they were looking for Dan. Dan was Hispanic. The moment he saw Dan and knew that he was a Hispanic male, Dan wasn't getting back on that bus until that bag was checked, because he's looking for drugs. I mean, the guy's doing drug interdiction, and he's at the Greyhound station, and that's where drugs get shipped, is on the Greyhound bus. Yeah, you know.
I want to know what drug interdiction looks like, because I just don't know, like, what does a cop do if the cop's at a Greyhound station doing that?
How many of you have been through a sobriety checkpoint? No. Okay, drug interdiction is almost like an administrative process. We will at random pull bags at a particular location because we know that people, so like when I set up a sobriety checkpoint on a Friday night about midnight, I know that folks go out and party on Friday night. I know they like to drink. I'm going to randomly choose from this stop point folks to blow and to give a field sobriety test to. As long as I'm doing it randomly and not based upon race, like I do every 3rd car. I've got some procedural methodology that we follow. That's not a search. That's an administrative action taking for the health and welfare and protection. And because it's not a search, any evidence that I acquire from it is not unreasonable. And it wasn't necessary that I have probable cause. So the question actually becomes here was what the investigator knows was doing. Why was he there? What led him to take each individual step? So the deconstruction of each individual step and its application is important. Now I want to set you up for class on Monday. On Monday, we're going to do the following problem. I want you to look at it. It's a practical exercise. These are the rules for my daughter when she lived at my home. I'm concerned about safety, her time for sleep, her time for homework, and her social development. All 4 of these are important to me. We're going to read a series of cases to decide which of these is actually most important, right? And I'm going to throw them up here on the screen, and then you guys can, I don't remember if these are in the book or not. I don't think they are they? Are they at the end of the introductory chapter? I will post the PowerPoint slides on Blackboard, forcing you to go to them. I'll probably do this sometime today. On Friday, October 1st, she attends a high school football game, which ends at 9:45. She joins some friends for pizza, and they get home at 11:15, and I am unhappy. I said, next time, don't hang out at the pizza parlor. You need your sleep, and you've got plenty of homework to do. What rules do you get from that case? We won't do it in class now, but I want you to do it at home. Extract the rules. The next one. The next Friday, she goes to another football game. She gets home. That ends at 9:45. She goes to her friends for pizza, and she's home by 10:55. I welcome her home with loving arms and tell her that if she hurries, she could be in bed by 11:30. What rule comes from that case? Does it give you more clarity when you read scenario 1 and scenario 2 together or not. The next week she goes to a volleyball game and a band performance. And both nights she's home by 11, and I am happy with that. On Saturday afternoon, she asked if she could go to an early movie with her friends, and I tell her no. You've already been out twice this week, and you've got homework to catch up on, and I want you in bed at a reasonable time. This one's a little harder. What rule can you pull out of that? Whoops. Hit the wrong button. During the week, oh, wait. Okay, here we are. She goes to a movie on Thursday evening, a dance on Friday night. She's home by 11. When she gets home on Friday, I remind her that we're going to her uncle and aunt's 50th wedding anniversary on Saturday. She's pissed. She thought she would be expected to spend the rest of the weekend on her homework. And I tell her, well, you probably should, but the whole family is going, and this is an important event. Then she goes to a school play. She goes to a dance on Friday. They get home by 10:45. She's parked in the driveway. They talk in the car for a few minutes while I clean my shotgun on the porch. She comes in the house at 11:15. The next day she wants to go to her brother's first basketball game with some friends. There will be several more home games, and I'm not attending this one. Were lawyer's actions on Friday and her request on Saturday consistent with my rules? So in other words, I want you to read each of the fact patterns has substantive case law. Examples of trying to determine what's most important to me from a rules perspective of the 4 rules that I gave you. And then this is the last piece. I want you to summarize the rules and the sub-rules, the issues, what you think is the common law jurisprudence that comes from each fact pattern. And keep in mind my 4 overriding principles. Safety, personal development, yada, yada. I don't care if you do it individually or if you do it in small groups and study groups. I'm not worried about that. But what I do want you playing with is this idea of pulling concepts from fact patterns and identifying overarching principles. Because the secret to this class this semester is that at the end of the day, you read a 20-page or a 30-page case, and you can condense it to a small, short paragraph of material or a test that you then commit to memory and apply in various situations. Because if you can take the case and read it and deconstruct it and understand it to the point that you can pull the principles out of it, which we will do literally for every single case we read, at the end of the semester, you'll have a complete grasp of the information. So that means, Professor Rose, what should I read? The answer is the cases in order. I wrote the book. I wrote this book because the book that I used to use when it went north of $250 in cost, I thought that's just ludicrous for cases. I'm just going to pull them, their public record, and I'll print the book and make the class much more cost-friendly for the student. But that means that I arrange them in the order. I am literally going to start at the beginning of the book and go all the way through. So, judge, when you come to class and hear the lecture, judge where I am and assess yourself how far you think you need to read ahead to be capable of maintaining the material. I'm going to presume that everybody's reading the cases in order. And I'm going to always feel comfortable that I can just go on to the next one and talk. So you need to stay ahead of me. If you do that and you just commit this to part of your study process over the course of the semester, you will find by the end of the semester that we're all the way to page 700 and something, and you've literally read every word and actually enjoyed it. Because if I hadn't edited the cases, it'd be about 2,000 words. All right? Questions? It's supposed to go active today. These problems will be posted either today or tomorrow, and you'll have plenty of time between now and Monday to get them done. All right, guys. See you on Monday.